He barked at the judge and exposed a war crime. One single bark, sharp and deliberate, in a courtroom built on silence. That's all it took. No one moved, no one breathed. Because somewhere deep down, everyone knew. The dog wasn't barking at a man. He was barking at a ghost. A name erased from military files. A face that had ordered men to die and then ordered the truth to vanish with them. But this dog, he didn't forget. He waited, he remembered, he came back. This isn't a story about a soldier. It's about the canine they tried to bury. The one who outlived the mission, outlived the lies, and returned not to fight but to testify. Through instinct, through memory, through that one final bark, what he saw, what he knows, what he carries, it will shatter everything. If you're watching this, tell me, when did you realize the truth? Comment where you're watching from. Like if your heart skipped a beat. Subscribe if you're staying for the whole truth. This story doesn't begin in the war. It begins the moment the dog walks back into the courtroom. And everything changed. The morning sun broke gently across the courthouse steps, painting the concrete in warm gold and long shadows. Every day, like clockwork, he came, boots polished, shoulders squared beneath a weathered army jacket still bearing faded insignia. His name was Mark Talbot, a retired sergeant whose silence seemed louder than any protest. At his side, tethered by a worn leather leash, was Shadow, a massive German shepherd with coal duck eyes and a presence that could freeze a crowd mid-strike. They never missed a day, not even Sundays. Mark would sit on the top step, just under the brass plaque that read County Courthouse. People noticed. They always did. Some whispered, others simply nodded in solemn respect. But none dared interrupt. There was something hauntingly precise about his ritual. He never begged, never shouted, never carried a sign. Just him and the dock, still, waiting. At first, the courthouse staff had tried to engage. A junior clerk once asked if he needed help. Mark simply, Thackeray. After that, they let him be. Even security officers, some ex-military themselves, knew better than to question his right to be there. It was as if, despite no formal business inside, the steps belonged to him. By the second week of his vigil, courthouse guards began holding the side gate open at precisely 7:58 a.m. No orders were given. No policy changed, but everyone knew. Mark and Shadow passed through without a word. Their boots and paws echoed off the marble tiles with a familiarity that felt earned, not granted. It became routine, like sunrise, but to outsiders it was a mystery, one that pulsed with the weight of something unresolved. One drizzly Thursday, a reporter from the local paper, a young woman named Andrea Shaw, waited with a camera hidden in her coat. She watched him arrive, take his seat, and settle like stone. She snapped a photo. Shadow turned, growled low just once, and the sound made her chest tighten. Mark's gaze found her lens. He didn't move, didn't speak, but Andrea lowered her camera all the same. Somehow, she felt ashamed. Later that day, she visited the courthouse records office. She searched for his name. Nothing. No open case, no petition, no filed appeal. It didn't make sense. But she wasn't the first to ask. Officer Dean Walker, head of courthouse security, once asked an old judge about him. The judge replied, "He's not waiting for justice to be served. He's waiting for the truth to be seen." That cryptic remark only deepened the mystery. Mark had no appointment, no subpoena, yet no one dared to stop him. Andrea dug deeper. She called the VA, confidential. She called the police, no comment. She tried the Pentagon, no such name in active files. But Shadow, he had a tattoo on his left ear. Andrea took a blurry zoomed-in photo and ran it through a canine registry. Shadow was once part of a special canine unit, retired 4 years ago after sustaining injuries in a classified operation. The handler's name listed, Sergeant Mark Talbot. She published a short column, no accusations, just observations. Every morning, a man sits on the courthouse steps. His dog waits with him. No one tells them to leave, no one dares. And maybe that's because we all know some things are heavier than truth, and silence is the loudest way to carry them. The article went viral in the county, but Mark never acknowledged it. He returned the next day, and the next. Only once did someone break his rhythm. A small boy, maybe 10, approached with a crumpled drawing of a soldier and a dog. He said, "You look like the heroes in my comic books." Mark didn't reply, but Shadow leaned forward, sniffed the paper, and gently licked the boy's hand. His mother cried. People began to leave things like coffee cups, thank you notes, and small flags. Mark ignored them. Shadow never touched them, yet no one took offense. It was understood. They weren't there to be thanked. They were there because something had been taken. Then one morning, it changed. Mark stood, Shadow stood beside him. Together they climbed the steps. Not to sit, but to walk inside. Security led them through without question. The clerk at the front desk stood up. "Sergeant Talbot," he began, but Mark raised a hand. "I'm here for the docket." "What case, sir?" He paused. "Mine." The clerk stared at Mark as if trying to place a name with a ghost. "Mine, eventually." The words lingered in the air like smoke, unsettling, ambiguous, impossible to challenge. Mark didn't wait for permission. He turned away, Shadow pacing evenly beside him, and moved deeper into the courthouse as if he knew it better than the architects who built it. The hallway lights flickered as they passed, a low hum filling the silence they dragged behind them. Every officer, intern, and lawyer they passed paused, not out of recognition, but something else of deference mixed with an uncanny sense that this man, this dog, carried something unfinished, dangerous, perhaps even holy. 4 years ago, before he became the silent monument on the courthouse steps, Mark Talbot was a legend in the K-9 Division of the U.S. Army. He had commanded Operation Emberlight, a high-risk, off-the-books mission that never made it to public records. His unit specialized in tracking insurgents through chemically altered terrain. But what set them apart wasn't just Mark's precision, it was the synergy between him and Shadow, his K-9 partner, trained from birth not only in scent and retrieval but also in advanced threat identification. A military experiment that only one dog had survived, Shadow. They'd served in Syria, Sudan, and classified zones too gray for maps, clearing bomb-rigged tunnels and locating kidnapped assets faster than any drone or satellite. In the field, they moved as one. If Mark blinked, Shadow was already halfway through the next command. Then came the mission that rewrote everything. A compound in northern Lebanon. Intel said it was a black mark chemical weapons depot, protected by rogue militants. Command was thin on details but heavy on urgency. Mark's unit was deployed within 12 hours. 12 men, 1 dog. None returned except Mark and Shadow. But Mark didn't come back as a hero, he came back in shackles. According to the tribunal report, intercepted satellite feeds showed Mark entering the compound, uploading encrypted data to an external drive, then initiating an unsanctioned withdrawal. Minutes later, a secondary blast leveled the building. American casualties. Classified tech compromised. The army called it treason. The press never got the details, only that a decorated soldier had betrayed his country. And yet the story had holes. Deep ones. Mark never defended himself. He stood trial in a sealed courtroom, denied legal representation outside the military. His only statement on record, "I didn't fail the mission failed." Shadow, the only other witness, had been retrieved from the field by a separate unit. The dog's behavior was reportedly erratic. Files classified, access denied. Not even Mark was allowed to see him for a year and a half. Shadow, it was as if he had been buried, evidence that barked and breathed. Meanwhile, Mark was dishonorably discharged, stripped of his rank, pension, and access to any classified documentation. He was released quietly, without prison time, on a legal technicality involving conflicting testimony from a communications officer who later died in a training accident. Mark returned to civilian life with nothing but silence, a scar under his right rib from shrapnel, and a nightmare that replayed every time he closed his eyes. Shadow, whining under rubble, licking Mark's bloodied hand, as explosions buried their unit one by one. 2 years later, Shadow reappeared, not through channels, not from any handler. Mark found him by accident, or perhaps fate, in a VA-funded canine rehabilitation shelter in Montana. The staff claimed the dog had been abandoned after a government program failed its funding review. No tag, no file, just a tattoo on the ear and a 1,000-yard stare that mirrored Mark's own. Shadow didn't recognize him at first, but when Mark whispered an old command, "Echo Fox 2, the dog froze, ears twitching, then slowly lowered his head to Mark's shoulder and exhaled. They had found each other in a world that wanted them to forget. Mark didn't speak to anyone during that drive home. He didn't explain why he'd palmed his last war medal to buy the crate. He didn't sleep that night. Neither did Shadow. They sat together on the floor of his one-room apartment, both breathing like something was still burning around them. From that night on, Mark began his pilgrimage to the courthouse every morning, without fail. Because there was still something broken, not just honor, not just memory, but proof. Inside the courthouse now, Mark walked past the hearing rooms, past the records office, until he reached the law library. He wasn't here to demand, he was here to build. Slowly, intentionally. Shadow sat at his heel while Mark pulled case files from dusty shelves, precedents on military misconduct, whistleblower protections, canine unit confidentiality. He wasn't a soldier anymore. He was becoming something more dangerous, a man with time, rage, and a map of where the system cracked. What the tribunal didn't know, or chose to forget, was that Mark had secured a backup. One encrypted drive, uploaded during the Lebanon op to a dormant server buried inside a civilian firm's cloud architecture. He hadn't accessed it in years. He didn't need to. Yet, back in the hallway, a young clerk approached him timidly. "Sir, you're not on the schedule today." Mark glanced up. Shadow stood. The clerk hesitated, then added, "Would you like the usual seat?" Mark gave a single nod. The clerk unlocked a private reading room normally reserved for judges. As Mark entered, he passed a mirror. He didn't pause, but the reflection lingered, an aging man with steel in his spine and a dog whose gaze carried the weight of war. Across town, in a government office lit by blue LED strips and digital silence, a man in a pressed uniform stared at a news clipping on his desk. "Talbert's back," he murmured. His assistant shifted uneasily. "He's got the dog." The man nodded once. "Then it's only a matter of time before the truth leaks." He tapped the desk 3 slow beats. "Activate protocol gray out. If Shadow remembers more than we trained him to forget, we're already too late." Shadow never barked. Not once. Not even when loud arguments erupted in the courtroom corridors, or when bailiffs slammed doors in frustration. He moved like muscle memory, each step a shadow of the soldier he once was. As Mark walked up the front steps each morning, Shadow's paw would touch the same stone ridge before halting at the 4th riser. Always the 4th, always the perfect heel. It was an instinct buried deep beneath fur and time, a habit from thousands of drills that never died. Lawyers in expensive suits gave him wide berths. Judges who once presided over high-stakes federal hearings stopped whispering when he passed. Mark didn't speak, didn't ask, didn't need to. His presence alone was an indictment, and Shadow, walking like time rewinding, was the evidence. In the law library, Mark sat with case folders sprawled like fallen soldiers across the oak table. Shadow lay beside him, alert yet still, one ear always angled toward the door. Mark had started to notice the way people avoided eye contact with the dog more than with him. It wasn't fear. It was reverence, almost superstition. Like Shadow knew things no man should and had seen things no courtroom could confirm. That week, a new envelope arrived at Mark's rented mailbox. No return address, no postmark, just his name in crisp block letters. He opened it carefully, expecting threats or bureaucratic warnings. Inside was a single photograph, aged, slightly warped from time, black and white with a jagged tear at the corner. The image struck him like a sniper's round. It showed Shadow, unmistakably younger but already formidable, sitting obediently beside a tall man in civilian clothes, handsome, sharp-eyed, and very dead. Mark knew that face. Everyone in the old unit did. Major Elliot Drexler, killed in a chopper explosion 5 years ago. Body burned beyond recognition. Medal of Valor awarded posthumously. He wasn't just a legend. He was the one who had designed Operation Emberlight, the mission that had destroyed Mark's career. But Shadow had never been assigned to Drexler. That's what the records said. That's what the handlers claimed. That's what the tribunal swore under oath. Yet here was the photograph. Drexler's hand resting on Shadow's shoulder like they were family. Like they'd worked together. Like the story was alive. Mark's pulse hammered as he flipped the photo. Scrawled in shaky handwriting was a date. March 11th, 2020. Before the betrayal. He felt something inside him tighten like a muscle he thought had atrophied. Rage, yes, but deeper than that, grief. If Drexler had handled Shadow before the mission, it meant the dog had memories, connections, and commands that Mark didn't know existed. It meant someone had rewritten history, and Shadow was the missing page. That night, Mark sat across from the dog in their dark apartment. He placed the photo on the floor. Shadow stared at it, unmoving. "Do you remember him?" Mark asked quietly. No reaction. "Did he give the order?" Still nothing. Then, Shadow lowered his head and let out a breath that trembled, not quite a growl, not quite a sigh. It was the closest thing to grief a dog could express, and it gutted Mark. The next morning, Mark arrived at the courthouse before the janitors. He didn't sit on the steps this time. He walked the full loop around the building, every sidewalk crack and brick wall a memory. Shadow followed, the eyes darting to familiar corners like they were running a mission. Something was shifting, not just in them but in the air itself. At 8:03 a.m., a man in a gray trench coat passed Mark and slipped something into his coat pocket without stopping. Mark didn't react until they turned the corner. A second envelope. Inside, a thumb drive. No label, no note. He waited until nightfall to open it. The file folder was encrypted but cracked under an old military code Mark once used for transmitting reports to Drexler. Inside, surveillance footage. Low-res timestamp, a hangar bay, Drexler, talking to two men, one of them Colonel Shaw, the same man who had testified against Mark in the tribunal. The other Mark didn't recognize, but Shadow did. The dog rose from the floor and began pacing the room, tail stiff, muscles tense. Mark paused the video. "Who is he?" he whispered. Shadow barked once, sharp, fast, involuntary. The first time in months. Then silence again. In the footage, Drexler handed over a hard case. The unknown man nodded. A transaction. A betrayal. The date matched the day before Operation Emberlight launched. It was enough, not for court, not yet, but enough to unravel something. Mark printed the still frames and filed them behind the photograph. The web was growing, and now he had proof it existed. By midweek, a clerk from Internal Military Affairs contacted Mark through a burner phone he hadn't used in years. Her voice was low, urgent. She said only this: "They scrubbed Drexler's training logs. Shadow's name was on them. Twice. You didn't see that. I never called." That night, Mark stood by the window, Shadow beside him, and stared into the street like expecting headlights that wouldn't come. They were being watched, not obviously but tactically, shadows that stayed one car length too far, faces that always turned away when looked at directly, cell towers that spiked when they walked past. He wasn't paranoid, he had trained others to do the same. In the morning, Mark dressed in full uniform. Not just the jacket, he polished the boots, pinned the medals, and shaved close enough to bleed. As they approached the courthouse, the guards stood taller. One saluted. Mark didn't return it. Shadow walked in perfect formation, stopping again always at the fourth step. Still no bark, still no break in rhythm. But this time, as Mark reached the double doors, Shadow looked up. Not at him. At the courthouse arch, like he expected someone to be watching. And someone was. Mark had always known the difference between being watched and being studied. Surveillance left a trail of bad timing, clumsy angles. The feeling of cold eyes behind black windows. But this was different. It was personal. It began the morning after the courthouse photo of Shadow and Drexler was burned into his memory like a second brand. Mark noticed the rhythm shift first, not in his own routine, but in others. The janitor, who usually greeted him at 6:00 a.m., had been replaced by a new guy with hands too clean for a mop. A man with a service tattoo half covered by civilian sleeves held the lobby door longer than necessary. Someone had started timing him, tracking his walk, not knowing where Shadow looked, and more than once Mark caught the same unfamiliar sedan parked across from his building, always with fogged windows, engine off, radio silent. The Shadow had changed too. His ears twitched more frequently, his paws tensed mid-stride. He would halt at random corners and look into blind alleys with a stillness that Mark remembered only from combat zones before a sniper hit, before a drone strike. Then one night, as Mark left the courthouse archives with a stack of copied records from a sealed military inquiry, he saw it across the street, under the pale glow of a flickering street lamp. A silhouette leaned against a fire escape like it belonged there. A tall frame, combat boots, no phone, no movement, just waiting. Mark didn't stop. He didn't turn. He walked past, one hand on Shadow's collar, the other tightening inside his coat where the hilt of an old combat knife waited. He didn't sleep that night. Instead, he cleaned the knife, rechecked the locks. Shadow paced the apartment until dawn. At 4:16 a.m., a quiet thud landed at the front door, paper on concrete. Mark opened it slowly. No one in sight. On the floor, a single folded sheet, military-grade fiber paper, the kind used in the field for maps and top-secret briefings. On it, in block lettering, Shadow still remembers. Be careful with the next hearing. That was it. No signature, no contact. But the handwriting was familiar in a way that made Mark's blood run cold. He had trained with that man, fought beside him, buried others next to him. Mark tore through his old files, digging past medals and reprimands, until he found it, a field report from the Syrian corridor, signed by Staff Sergeant Troy Becker, communications specialist, sniper cover, and the only man who ever beat Mark's record on a timed infiltration. Becker had disappeared 3 years ago after leaving the service under mysterious terms. Discharge reports claimed he moved to Alaska. Mark knew better. If Becker was here, if he had watched him, and if he had written this, it meant one thing. Whatever was coming next wasn't just political, it was tactical. Over the next week, Mark traced movements like chess pieces. The man in the sedan shifted parking spots. A black SUV drove behind him all the way to a laundromat, then vanished when Mark stepped outside. Drones buzzed above the courthouse, too quiet, too precise. Definitely not news media. Someone had activated assets, not to eliminate but to anticipate. Shadow began reacting more aggressively, not toward. One afternoon, as they passed an abandoned alley near 6th and Carson, Shadow stopped, stared at a brick wall smeared with old graffiti, then let out a soft, strangled sound halfway between a growl and a whimper. Mark followed the line of the dog's stare and saw it. A single set of boot prints, military standard issue, disappearing into the shadows. He followed the trail to the roof access, but there was nothing. No scent, no movement. Just a bottle cap wedged under the door hinged a message. Becker's habit during recon, I see you, I'm 2 steps ahead. That night, Mark laid out a decoy route. He took Shadow to a different courthouse entrance, changed his clothes mid-route, and looped back through the train station. Still, the sedan returned. Still, the eyes followed. Then, inside his apartment, a second envelope. Hand-delivered, placed in his locked filing cabinet. Impossible unless someone had keys or had been watching long enough to know when the spare was hidden. This time, the contents weren't just warnings. It was a photograph, grainy, black and white, time-stamped 2 weeks prior. Shadow in front of the courthouse. Mark nowhere in sight, but behind Shadow, in the reflection of the courthouse's glass panel, Becker's face stared back. No hat, no disguise, just a slight smirk like he wanted Mark to know. The message was clear. You're not alone in this, but you might be outmatched. Mark contacted the only man he still trusted in military circles, Colonel Marcus Reeve, now retired. Once his commanding officer and mentor. They met in the back of a storage unit on the east side. No cameras, no echoes. Reeve looked older, but his eyes were sharp. He studied the photo, then said, if Becker's involved, this goes beyond revenge or cleanup. He only moves for deep clearance work, psychological destabilization, soft kills before the real one. Mark nodded. Then what's the play? Reeve hesitated. They don't want you dead, Mark. Not yet. They want to see if Shadow's memory is intact. They're waiting for the dog to react in court to someone specific. Mark went cold. Someone on the bench? Reeve didn't answer. He didn't have to. The implication hung heavy. Shadow, with his silence, his stare, his perfect rhythm, he wasn't just reliving the past. He was recognizing something. Someone. And the next hearing, scheduled for Tuesday, was a public inquest into reopening classified records on Operation Emberlight. The judge presiding, a former legal advisor for the Department of Defense with 3 decades of military clearance. Shadow had locked eyes with him once and Mark hadn't noticed, until now. The night before the hearing, Shadow refused to sleep. He paced, he whined softly. He stood guard at the window for hours, unmoving. Mark knew the look. This wasn't anxiety, it was anticipation. Somewhere in the dark, someone else waited, someone who had trained for this moment longer than either of them knew. Tuesday arrived cloaked in tension so thick it made the courthouse walls feel closer than they were. Mark stood in front of the wide entryway, Shadow sitting alert by his side. Both of them dressed not for battle but for confrontation nonetheless. The rotunda was already buzzing with journalists, aides, and unfamiliar faces. Each one a possible set of eyes planted by those who didn't want the Emberlight files reopened. This hearing wasn't about guilt or innocence. Not officially. It was about control. About whether someone like Mark Talbot, discarded and disavowed, could pull truth out from under red tape and make it bleed in public. He waited outside courtroom 3B, reviewing the few notes he'd dared to jot on a folded legal pad, when a woman in a sharp navy suit approached. She moved with purpose, posture perfect, face carved from stone. Her hair was tied back tightly, her eyes shadowed by something harder than skepticism. "Sergeant Talbot," she said flatly. He turned slowly, nodding once. "That's me." She extended her hand, but not for a handshake. She offered a letter. "You've been reassigned counsel, effective immediately, due to your previous advocate's withdrawal." He didn't move. "Name?" he asked. "Evelyn Cross," she replied. His breath caught, not because he recognized her, but because of her last name. Cross. Like Lieutenant Daniel Cross, the signals tech from Mark's old unit, the one who died during the Lebanon op, the one Mark was accused of leading into a trap. Evelyn watched the realization flicker in his eyes and she nodded before he spoke. "He was my brother. You got him killed, or..." "That's what I thought for a long time." Mark remained silent, Shadow shifting slightly beside him. "So why are you here?" he asked finally. Evelyn looked at Shadow, then back at him. "Because something isn't adding up. And because your dog did something yesterday that made me question everything I thought I knew." She stepped aside, revealing a security tape on her tablet. Shadow, during a courthouse recess, had approached her without cue. Evelyn had been speaking to a clerk when the dog sat by her feet, placed his paw gently on her knee, and let out a soft, high-pitched rattle. Brief, sharp, unmistakable. "You recognize that sound?" she asked. Mark blinked. "That's a distress code," he said. "Level 2? Canine alert to compromised handler condition." Evelyn nodded. "He did it while I was talking about Drexler. I didn't even realize he was listening." She knelt beside Shadow, and then she said quietly, "He licked my hand." That stopped Mark, not because of the gesture, but because Shadow only did that once before to the medic who pulled shrapnel from Mark's ribs under fire. It was Shadow's way of saying someone mattered, that someone could be trusted. Evelyn stood. "I hated you, Sergeant. For years. I blamed you for everything. I even petitioned against your early release." Her voice didn't waver, but her eyes glossed with memory. "But if this dog, this animal who's trained to detect threats, stress, trauma, if he sees something worth trusting in me, then I need to re-examine what I know." Mark studied her. She wasn't acting. She wasn't bluffing. She was wounded, like him. Different scars, but the same damage. "Then let's get to work," he said simply. Inside the courtroom, things moved fast. Too fast. The judge, Raymond Cole, former Pentagon legal strategist, glanced at Mark only once, then buried himself in notes. Evelyn took the floor, her voice crisp, unwavering. "My client seeks not to relitigate a verdict," she began, "but to reopen a procedural corridor that was sealed under outdated national security provisions. The material evidence pertaining to Operation Emberlight was classified under Executive Order 12,984. But under Section 11 of the Justice Reform Act, declassification is permitted in cases involving falsified testimony or concealed chain-of-command interference." The room shifted. No one expected her to come in hot. Mark watched her command the space like someone born to interrogate shadows. Then the prosecution stood, a military-appointed attorney with 2 clean shoes and dead eyes. He objected, of course, cited irrelevance, invoked national security. Judge Cole waved it off for now, but everyone knew the real test wasn't words. It was the moment Shadow reacted. They introduced the first witness, Major Stephen Langford, the logistics coordinator for the Emberlight op. As he walked in, Shadow's ears rose. His head tilted. Mark held his breath, but Shadow stayed still. The second witness, however, a balding civilian advisor named Philip Heron, entered from the side door, and Shadow stood up, just rose, slow and silent. Heron froze mid-step. the bailiff noted. The judge glanced over. Evelyn leaned into the mic. Permission to note canine reaction for the record. Cole hesitated. Granted, he muttered. Shadow didn't bark. He didn't lunge, he just stared. But it wasn't normal. It was personal. After court adjourned, Evelyn turned to Mark in the hallway. That man Heron worked for the Department of Civilian Intelligence Logistics until 2019. Retired after an ethics investigation. He had ties to Drexler's strategic funding streams. Mark nodded slowly. And yet he's on the government's witness list. Evelyn exhaled sharply. They're protecting something. Back at the apartment, Mark sat at the kitchen table while Evelyn skimmed through pages of unsealed files she'd gained access to. Shadow lay at her feet. At one point, her hand brushed the floor, and Shadow placed his paw over hers. She paused. Does he always do that? She asked. No, Mark said, voice low. He only does that when he senses a storm coming. Courtroom 3B was unusually packed for a procedural session. Journalists lined the rear benches, their notepads jittering with anticipation, while defense contractors and military liaisons pretended to be observers, but clutched black briefcases with the same anxious grip one might use for a live grenade. Mark sat calmly at the defense table, his hands interlocked in front of him, staring straight ahead. Evelyn stood beside him, her laptop connected to the courtroom display, a dozen files open and flagged with digital bookmarks. Shadow lay at Mark's feet, still as stone until the prosecution walked in. The lead prosecutor was a lean man with hawk-like eyes and a smugness carved deep into his bones. But it wasn't him who drew Shadow's attention. It was the man 2 steps behind him, a federal investigative analyst named Rickson Hayes. According to the seating chart, he wasn't scheduled to speak, just observe. He carried a charcoal gray rolling case, standard issue for government forensics personnel. Shadow's ears twitched. His breathing changed. Mark noticed it immediately. Evelyn whispered, "He's focusing on the case." Mark nodded once. Not just focusing, he's calculating. The hearing began with procedural arguments about the chain of custody for old field records. Evelyn made her case sharply, citing 3 precedents that forced the judge to lean forward and actually engage. But the real shift came 22 minutes into the session, when the prosecution referred to Exhibit 14A segment of video footage from Emberlight, submitted at the original tribunal but deemed incomplete due to corruption. Evelyn stood. Objection. The digital integrity of Exhibit 14 has never been verified by a neutral party. The judge raised an eyebrow. Do you have evidence to support that claim? Before Evelyn could answer, Shadow moved. At first it was subtle. He stood, walked a few paces toward the prosecution table, paused and growled, not loud but low, guttural, direct. Then, in an instant, he surged forward. Evelyn gasped. Mark rose halfway, but it was already happening. Shadow leapt, not at a person, but directly onto the table, papers scattered. Pens flew and his claws sank into the top of Rickson Hayes' gray case. He barked once, sharp and focused, then began scratching furiously at the latch. The courtroom exploded in motion. Bailiffs rushed forward. The judge shouted for order. Evelyn stepped in front of Mark instinctively, but he didn't move. He watched Shadow tear at the case like it was hiding a bomb. Hayes tried to intervene, his voice rising in panic. Call him off, that's government property. But no one moved, not even the guards. Shadow's training was too specific, too deliberate. This wasn't aggression, it was a detection. And Mark knew it. Finally, one of the bailiffs, a Marine veteran himself, leaned forward and popped the case latch open. Shadow immediately stopped clawing and sat, tail stiff, gaze locked on what lay in a black external hard drive, wrapped in a velvet pouch. Hayes lunged to grab it. Evelyn was faster. She snatched the pouch and held it up. What is this? She asked. Hayes stammered, just backup documentation, part of our analysis logs. Evelyn's voice sharpened. Is this encrypted? Of course. What type? Level 4 military grade. Then why wasn't it disclosed to the defense? Silence. Evelyn turned to the judge. Your Honor, we request an immediate in-camera review of this device. Its undisclosed presence and the dog's reaction warrant judicial oversight. The judge, visibly rattled, nodded. Granted. Recess. All parties will reconvene after private review. Inside the chambers, Evelyn connected the drive to a secure laptop. Judge Cole leaned over her shoulder, arms crossed, mouth a thin line. Mark stood behind them, Shadow pacing slowly in the corner. The files were named with alphanumeric strings, cold, mechanical, but one stood out, EMVR-12. Origin. Mark leaned in. It was the mission, the compound in Lebanon. They saw Drexler giving a silent hand signal, the team advancing. Then an explosion, louder, closer than the official report had indicated. The camera fell, smoke, screams, then something else. The audio wasn't corrupted. That was the first shock. And what it captured was damning. Drexler's voice, speaking into a mic. Passage transferred. Pull trigger once Talbot breaches. Mark's heart sank. Evelyn's eyes widened. They set you up? Mark clenched his jaw. Keep playing. The footage continued. Drexler exited the compound from a back route not mentioned in any report. 30 seconds later, the blast took out most of the building. The metadata showed the file was never logged into the primary case archive. It had been saved separately on Hayes's drive. Back in court, Evelyn presented a motion to admit the footage. The judge reviewed it privately, said nothing for a full 5 minutes, then returned to the bench. This evidence directly contradicts prior testimony and classification status, he said slowly. The court will permit its inclusion pending authentication. Outside the courtroom, Hayes had disappeared. His name vanished from the observer registry within an hour. His clearance badge was deactivated. A federal sweep confirmed he had checked out the drive 6 months ago, classified as corrupted evidence for departmental review, and never logged it back. Shadow had remembered the scent, the exact metallic oil blend Hayes used to maintain the zipper seams, something Mark hadn't even known the dog was trained for. That night, Evelyn sat across from Mark in the apartment, rewatching the footage on mute. They knew, she said softly. They all knew. Mark said nothing. Shadow sat between them, eyes fixed on the screen. At the exact moment Drexler gave the signal, Shadow let out the same high-pitched rattle, the distress code from deep in his chest. Evelyn didn't flinch this time. He still hears it, she whispered. Mark nodded. Because he was trained to. Because he was there. Because they can erase records. They can bury files. But they can't erase what he remembers. Somewhere across town, in a hidden terminal of the Defense Integrity Office, a man in a beige suit received an alert. Unauthorized access detected. File MVVOR-12 played outside the approved network. He tapped a receiver in his ear and muttered, "They found the drive. Activate rollback protocol. Make it disappear." The video wasn't just a fragment from the Emberlight op, it was a fracture line. A splinter that ran so deep through the military story that the entire facade began to creak. As Evelyn enhanced the video frame by frame, pausing at each flicker of movement, she adjusted the color scale and magnified the moment Drexler passed through the back corridor. 3 seconds before the final detonation, a man stood in the corner of the shot, partially obscured by smoke and crates, but visible enough to draw a breath from Evelyn. "Mark," she said, pointing. "That's Lieutenant Daniel Cross." Mark leaned closer. "That's impossible. Cross died during the blast. I saw the report." Evelyn's voice dropped. "So did I. I read his autopsy." The figure in the footage wasn't just a passing shadow. He turned his head toward the camera for a half second, enough for facial recognition software to run a match with 98% certainty, despite the grain. Lieutenant Daniel Cross, KIA, Lebanon 2020. But there he was, alive, standing behind Drexler, holding a field comms device. The timestamp confirmed he was present after the point of supposed death. Evelyn backed the footage up, looked again, and noticed something chilling. Cross had tapped a code on the comm unit, a series of pulses identical to the distress signal Shadow had made. It was coordinated, intentional. They ran every known database, every personnel list, and even covert field logs. No one had seen Cross after 2020. He was buried with military honors. Closed casket, cause of death, blast trauma, no viable remains. But Mark had been at that funeral. He remembered the weight of the silence, the bitterness in the air. If he's alive, Evelyn whispered, then he's not just a loose end. He's part of the cover-up. Shadow stood by the screen, staring at the image as if memory had returned in perfect detail. Then he sat, not moving, not blinking. Mark crouched beside him. "You knew," he said softly. "All this time, you knew he wasn't gone." Shadow lowered his head. The next day in court, tension crackled through every conversation. The judge was reserved, distant, more than usual. Evelyn noticed it too. "He knows something's shifting," she muttered. "He's preparing for disruption." Then the jury was brought in. 12 men and women, average in appearance, chosen supposedly at random. But Mark's eyes landed on the 9th juror. A man with soft features, tan skin, and gray-streaked hair combed meticulously back. Something about him was wrong. Not his posture, not his clothes, his eyes. The way they scanned the room, calculating, not absorbing. Evelyn leaned in. "What?" Mark didn't answer. He just stared harder. Then he said, "Can you get me a still shot of that video again? The one with Cross looking at the camera." She nodded, confused, but did it anyway. Side by side, the screen lit up with 2 images. The man in the video, the man on the jury. Evelyn scoffed at first. "No, that's not waiting." She zoomed in, adjusted the cheekbones, and ran a symmetry scan. The algorithm flagged a 91% match. Then it overlaid a surgical facial reconstruction schema. With adjustments, implants, skin tone blending, the result was undeniable. Allison's voice was back. "Him? He's on the jury." Mark exhaled, a sound like steel cracking. They didn't hide him, they put him in plain sight. Evelyn's mind raced. Why? To manipulate the verdict? To monitor the proceedings? Or worse, to make sure no one walks away? They filed an emergency request to the judge to examine the juror's identity. It was denied too late in the process, too disruptive, too risky. Evelyn slammed the file shut in frustration. "You're protecting him, he's got clearance way above this courtroom." Mark stood by the window, watching the courtyard fill with silent suits and low whispers. "He's not here to vote," he said. "He's here to trigger something." Evelyn didn't respond at first. Then she said, "Shadow's going to know if he's dangerous." Mark nodded. "That's the only reason we're still alive." The following morning, during testimony review, Evelyn intentionally brought up Cross's name. She spoke clearly, letting it land like a dropped coin. And if Cross had survived, which we now suspect, the integrity of the entire field report collapses. The moment the name echoed through the room, Shadow turned his head directly at juror number 9. The man didn't flinch, but his right eye twitched just once. Shadow rose slowly. His tail stiffened, his ears went back. Then he emitted the same high-pitched rattle. The code, the signal, the warning. Every head turned. Evelyn said nothing. The judge asked the jury to disregard the speculative reference. But something had changed. Mark watched Cross, if that's who he truly was, grip the armrest tighter than before. Shadow never took his eyes off him. That night, Evelyn pulled the medical files from the defense subpoena archives. She found something odd. The juror had no medical records dated earlier than 2 years ago. No dental, no blood work, no prescriptions. His profile began in 2021, as if he were born a man already in his 50s. A manufactured identity, government-issued. Evelyn sat back in her chair. They planted him, in the jury, in our trial. He's the final lever. Mark didn't blink. Then we find the fulcrum. Shadow paced the apartment restlessly, pausing by the door every few minutes as if sensing movement behind it. Mark watched him. He knows Cross is alive, he remembers more than they expected. And now Cross knows that Shadow remembers. Somewhere beneath the Pentagon, in a meeting room without windows, a group of silent figures watched courtroom footage in silence. One turned to the others. "Cross has been exposed. The dog's memory retention is beyond protocol. We have to act before the verdict." Another nodded. "Prepare the fallback sequence. If Shadow reacts again, trigger phase 0. The courtroom air was different that morning. Dense, brittle, charged like the stillness before a desert lightning strike. Everyone felt it, though no one admitted it. The prosecution had called a last-minute witness, someone described only as a technical logistics consultant for NATO joint operations. And the request had come without warning, without clearance for Evelyn to vet the witness in advance. Mark watched the judge approve it without a blink. Evelyn leaned toward him, her voice like a needle sliding between ribs. "They're tightening the noose. Whatever happens today, don't speak. Let Shadow speak first." The double doors opened. The man who walked in wore a civilian suit, but he moved with too much restraint for a bureaucrat. His body was lean, angular, and honed. He had short, well-cut hair and an unremarkable face for get-up. But the moment he crossed the threshold, Shadow reacted. At first, it was just posture rigid, spine straight, head low. Then the rumble began, a low growl rising from deep in his chest. Evelyn stiffened. Mark touched Shadow's collar, but he was already gone. With a roar that shattered the silence, Shadow lunged forward, barking with a fury that had never once surfaced during any prior testimony. The courtroom exploded into chaos. Bailiffs shouted. The judge pounded the gavel. Reporters gasped. The witness froze mid-step, eyes wide, and that was when it happened. Shadow didn't attack the man's arm or leg. He went for the hem of his pants, his jaws locking around the fabric, foaling, tearing. The man tried to shake him off, stumbling back into the bench as Shadow yanked downward. From the torn seam, something fell, a thin, knotted piece of green tactical paracord. Mark stood. The noise around him dissolved. That cord was distinctive. He'd tied it himself during Emberlight as part of a gear check. A piece meant only for his kit, knotted in a pattern the unit called Dead Man's Lock. After the blast, it had disappeared, presumed vaporized along with the rest of the field supplies. Yet here it was, dropping to the floor from the pants of a man who was supposed to be neutral. Evelyn was already moving, retrieving it with gloved hands, holding it up before the judge. Exhibit request, she snapped. Immediate custody. The bailiff hesitated only a second before taking it. The Shadow stood between the man and Mark now, tail rigid, ears back, head turned slightly in defensive posture. Not a threat, a barrier. The man said nothing, but his eyes were screaming. Evelyn approached slowly. Name, she demanded. Logan Ferris, he replied, his voice too smooth. Civilian contractor for the NATO resupply division. Evelyn raised an eyebrow. You were never in Lebanon? Then explain why this cord, standard U.S. military paracord, with a field knot only used by Recon Alpha teams during Operation Emberlight, was pulled from your pants. He glanced at the judge. No comment without counsel. Evelyn's voice dropped. You are under oath. The judge called an emergency recess. The courtroom emptied in ripples of whispers. Evelyn, Mark, and Shadow were escorted to the side chamber. Paracord secured in a sealed evidence bag. Inside, Evelyn fumed. This isn't just perjury. That cord links him directly to the blast zone, which means he was either embedded or part of the damn setup. Mark's jaw was tight, hands clenched around the chair, and Shadow knew. He's been holding back all this time, waiting for the right scent, the right movement. That was no accident. Later that day, Evelyn submitted a motion for forensic DNA testing on the cord. In response, the prosecution filed a motion to suppress, arguing chain of custody contamination. The judge didn't rule, not yet, but the seed had been planted. Shadow's behavior had crossed a line, no longer just memory, but evidence. Evelyn whispered, he's more than a witness, he's the last thread tying all this together. In private, Evelyn and Mark reviewed photos of Ferris from earlier deployments. None existed. No history, no birth certificate predating 2003. Facial scans returned multiple flagged matches, including one connected to a defunct intelligence cell in South Africa. He's not just a plant, Evelyn said. He's a ghost with a body count. Mark nodded slowly. And now he's visible. Evelyn sat back, exhaling. Shadow's not barking at ghosts anymore. He's dragging them into the light. That night, someone broke into Evelyn's office. Nothing was stolen, but the door was ajar, the file cabinet rearranged. On the desk, a single photo of Shadow as a pup, in basic canine training, standing beside an unnamed handler. The image had a red stamp across it. Yoka Class Zeta. Evelyn stared at it. This wasn't just about you, Mark. This has always been about him. They erased his origins. Mark said nothing, only looked at Shadow, who had once again curled up by the door, waiting for something that hadn't yet arrived but was coming. 2 days before the final hearing, Evelyn unlocked her office at 6:12 a.m. The way she did every morning, the rhythm of clockwork and quiet. But that morning was wrong. Her chair was slightly turned. The power strip under her desk had been unplugged and reinserted, and her laptop, which contained all the case files, encrypted copies of every video transcript and the most crucial element, the duplicated hard drive footage from Exhibit EMTR-12, was missing. No signs of forced entry, no camera footage, no fingerprints. Only an open window, 4th floor, latched loosely from the inside. Within the hour, Courthouse IT confirmed the last login attempt had come from her terminal, executed at 3:14 a.m., routed through a military-grade VPN, accessing the video file and deleting it from the shared archive. The backup drive in her personal safe was still there, but it had been wiped clean. The security specialist whispered one word like a confession. Ghosts Protocol. Evelyn stood motionless. Mark said nothing. He didn't need to. He turned to Shadow, who was already standing at the door, ears perked, tail low, head angled toward the hallway. He was waiting for a command Mark didn't give aloud. They left the courthouse in silence. Outside, the sky was thick with heat, late afternoon sun slicing through the trees like blades. Mark drove without destination, only following Shadow's shifting posture in the back seat. The dog would growl low, then glance right, then sit still, then whimper faintly at a red light near Route 12. Mark followed his instincts, not his own, but Shadow's. The road narrowed into dirt, then gravel, then nothing but weed-choked paths leading to nowhere, until it led to the cemetery. It wasn't listed on any modern map. The sign was gone. The gate rusted half open. The ground cracked like dried skin. Shadow leapt from the vehicle before it stopped moving. Mark followed him on foot, Evelyn behind them, questions rising like dust but unspoken. Shadow wove through the gravestones like a memory retraced, stopping finally at a spot marked only by a fragment of shattered stone. He began digging. Mark dropped to his knees beside him, his hands moving in tandem. The dirt gave way faster than expected. Within minutes, the shovel blade struck something solid, a military-grade waterproof case. Mark lifted it carefully. It wasn't Evelyn's laptop, or the prosecution's brief. It was older, scratched, sealed in tape labeled Archive 7. He opened it. Inside was the missing hard drive marked with the same barcode as MVBTW12, but thicker, heavier, marked with an additional line of black ink. Red layer. Beneath the drive, folded and wrapped in oilcloth, was a document. Mark unrolled it slowly on a nearby headstone. It was a strategic terrain overlay of Emberlight's original mission map, but not the version they were shown in court. This one showed alternate entry routes, shadow deployments, and an extraction plan labeled. At the bottom was a signature handwritten, unmistakable. General Arthur Penn, then Chief of Joint Operations. The same man who had testified that no such alternate plan ever existed. The same man who had sentenced Mark to silence. Evelyn stared, her mouth dry. He lied under oath. He denied this map existed. Mark ran his fingers over the paper. Because if this version existed, it proves the team was rerouted. That Drexler's backdoor exit wasn't a rogue move. It was by design, and that means the trap was deliberate. Shadow already brought us here. That's more than instinct, that's a memory. Shadow sat beside the case now, panting softly but alert, watching the wind, watching the stillness. Mark took out a small portable reader from the trunk. He connected it to the hard drive. The screen lit up. This time there was more than video. There were audio logs, communications between Drexler and an unidentified third party, time sacks matching the moments before the blast. Evelyn hit play. Voice 1, confirmation on Talbot's unit entering Zone 3. Voice 2, Drexler was to know, you can rapidly return to help lead. Voice 1, understood. Recommend extraction phase Delta. Your exit is hot. Voice 2, copy that. Phase 0 initiated. Evelyn froze. Phase 0. The same phrase used by the Pentagon Shadow team monitoring our case. It wasn't a code for strategy. It was a code for execution cover-up in motion. Mark folded the map, resealing it. We don't take this back to the courthouse, not yet. They knew how to wipe Evelyn's office without a trace. They'll bury this again. Deeper this time. She looked at him. Then Mark stared at the decaying cemetery, at the broken stone, at the way Shadow still scanned the tree line like ghosts were waiting in ambush. We bury it where they can't reach. Then we bring the storm to them. Across the city, inside a high-security wing of a federal intelligence compound, red alerts flashed across 3 terminals. One technician leaned into a headset. Target Talbot has retrieved Archive 7. Shadow has confirmed GPS backtracking. They're preparing for an The man at the console didn't speak. He pressed a sequence on his keyboard, initiating a protocol long dormant. The screen flashed one word: engage. The final hearing unfolded beneath skies heavy with unspoken tension. The courthouse bathed in sterile light as if afraid of casting shadows. Evelyn entered with the hard drive secured in a locked briefcase, the strategic map folded tightly in her coat pocket. Mark walked beside her, not just as a defendant but as something far more dangerous, a man with the truth in hand. Shadow moved at his side, silent, sharp, more alert than ever. Inside courtroom 3B, the atmosphere was different. Not chaotic, not loud, but loaded with expectation. Everyone present knew something irreversible was about to occur. The prosecution appeared poised, expressionless, but Mark noticed the glance too quick exchanged between the military liaison and the court clerk, a signal of unease beneath composure. Judge Raymond Cole sat high behind the bench, his gavel untouched, his gaze colder than usual. He cleared his throat, voice smooth but lacking conviction. This court is prepared to deliver its ruling, the evidence presented. He paused, fingers brushing the edge of his folder. Evelyn rose abruptly. Your Honor, before you continue, the defense respectfully requests permission to submit one final exhibit, critical to the integrity of these proceedings. The judge didn't blink. Denied. The record is closed. Evelyn persisted. This evidence directly involves procedural fraud and concealment by parties involved in the original tribunal. The judge leaned forward. Counsel, sit down. His tone sliced through the courtroom. Evelyn froze. Mark stood. The judge struck the gavel. You are out of order, Sergeant Talbot. And then it happened. Shadow, still lying at Mark's feet, shot up with a growl so primal it stunned the room. He snarled, teeth bared, eyes locked not on the prosecution, not on the jury, but on the bench itself, on Judge Raymond Cole. In a flash, Shadow bounded forward, growling louder now, vibrating with a force he had never shown in public. Bailiffs moved, but hesitated. Evelyn shouted, "Don't touch him." Shadow didn't attack. He stopped just below the bench, front paws clawing at the judge's dais, body rigid, eyes furious, and emitted one chilling bark, long, guttural, deliberate. The room froze. Mark stepped forward. Shadow, he called. The dog didn't turn. Evelyn's voice trembled. He's not reacting to the gavel. He's reacting to the man. The judge stared down at the dog, then at Mark. Control your animal, he said, voice taut. But Shadow didn't stop. He barked again, then did something no one had seen him do before. He began to dig at the base of the bench, scratching like something was buried beneath it. Something he needed to become the most. Evelyn pulled out the strategic map and the hard drive, holding them aloft. Your Honor, she declared, you know what this dog smells because you were there when this file was classified. You weren't a judge then. You were a commanding officer. General Cole, Chief Liaison of Joint Operations 2020. The signature on this map, it's yours. A gasp rippled through the room. The military liaison stood. That's impossible, he stammered. Judge Cole was never... Evelyn turned the screen toward the room. The signature on the map mapped perfectly with archived military documents from Emberlight's original command chain. And beneath that, a clearance form bearing the name Arthur Raymond Cole, signed in 2021 to authorize the deletion of all residual Emberlight field data under Operation Echo Silence. Cole stood, his hand trembling on the gavel. This proceeding is adjourned, he began, but his voice faltered. Shadow barked again, now joined by murmurs in the courtroom, doubt blooming like wildfire. A man in the back shouted, "You lied under oath." Another voice, "He was in the tribunal." Mark stepped forward. Your Honor, or should I say General Cole, you weren't just an advisor. You were the one who approved Drexler's field orders. You authorized Phase 0, and when it went wrong you buried it. You buried me. Cole's face was pale now, sweat forming at his brow. Enough, he said hoarsely. But Evelyn wasn't finished. The hard drive you tried to suppress shows your voice, your orders confirming the timing of the detonation, your agreement with Drexler, and your instruction to eliminate any surviving dissenting field units. She slammed the briefcase open. It's over. The judge backed away from the bench. Shadow barked once more, then sat, as if satisfied. The courtroom descended into chaos. Reporters stood. Jurors whispered frantically. The prosecution dissolved into silence. A federal agent entered from the rear, flashing a badge. Judge Cole, you're hereby remanded to federal custody under suspicion of conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and treason. Cole didn't protest. He simply turned to Mark. You weren't supposed to come back. Mark looked down at Shadow. Neither was he. The next week, the court dismissed all charges against Mark Talbot. The tribunal was declared null. The case was declassified. Evelyn was offered a permanent role with the Department of Military Oversight. She declined. Instead, she opened a private legal practice for veterans fighting government suppression. Shadow was retired with full honors. During the ceremony, he stood beside Mark on the courthouse steps one last time. Same place, same posture. But this time, no silence. Mark looked out over the crowd, voice steady. Justice wasn't broken. It was hijacked. And it took a soldier without a voice to speak the truth. Shadow barked once. A clean, clear sound. The kind that echoed. The kind that stayed. If this story moved you, consider liking and subscribing to support more stories like this one. I'd love to hear your thoughts. What moment hit you the hardest? And who do you think knew the truth all along? Drop a comment below and let me know where you're watching from. Let's talk about it.